Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are joining us. My name is Anthony Mills. I am the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute, GI&I. As most of you know, GI&I is the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership organization in the field of applied business innovation. Our programs are applied globally around the world, working through our authorized providers everywhere around the world to support individuals and organizations in developing innovation capabilities. As part of that, we host our monthly webinar series where we have different guests join us to continue to expand our knowledge of innovation practice and leading thoughts and activities and so forth. So I want to thank you. Today is August 26, 2025, and this is our August 2025 webinar. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce you, if I may, to our guest today and tell you a bit about him. And then after I introduce him, I'll turn it over to him and let him run the show for us. So our guest today is Mr. Jason Voiovich. Jason is an innovation advisor, coach, and fractional executive, as well as a highly prolific innovation historian and author, not to mention being a Jaywalker, something he's going to talk to us about. Jason is the author of 3 books focused on innovation history. In 2021, there was Marketer in Chief, How Each President Sold the American Idea. In 2023, there was Booze Babe and the Little Black Dress, How Innovators of the Roaring Twenties Created the Consumer Revolution. And then this year, 2025, he released Bullfrogs, Bingo, and the Little House on the Prairie, How Innovators of the Great Depression Made the Best of the Worst of Times. This last one, a re-examine of the Great Depression, clearly proves the old saying that necessity is the mother of invention. In researching these books, Jason discovered that successful innovators all have certain traits in common. And consequently, it was by studying innovation history in writing these last 2 books that helped him to crystallize the whole idea of the Jaywalker mindset. Today, Jason helps innovators not only learn this mindset, but apply it successfully. In fact, over the past 25 years, he has helped Fortune 500s and high-growth startups generate over $500 million in new product revenue. His unique approach combines his deep historical perspective, rigorous market analysis, and bold strategic actions, teaching leaders when, where, and how to intentionally break away from convention. Through his keynotes, workshops, and coaching programs, he has transformed how thousands of executives think about innovation and competitive advantage. Jason has personally launched hundreds of new products, everything from medical devices to virtual healthcare systems to non-dairy consumer cheese to next-generation alternatives to the dreaded cone of shame for pets and to even reproductive aids for cows, really. So Jason is a graduate of both the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota, and he has completed postgraduate studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His formal training was invaluable, but he credits his true success to growing up in a family of artists, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. They taught him how to carefully observe the world, see patterns before others notice them, and then use those insights to create new innovations. Indeed, history is Jason's favorite way of observing the world. He believes the people from the past have a lot to teach us about the challenges and opportunities we face today. You can learn more about Jason at jasonvoiovich.com. Today, Jason's going to talk to us about what separates those who talk about innovation from those who actually do it. To do this, he'll introduce the metaphor of a jaywalker, using that to unpack 10 defining personality traits shared by successful innovators past and present. From Coco Chanel to Clarence Birdseye, from Betty Crocker to Charles Lindbergh, these historical figures did not follow the rules. They broke norms, moved fast, and shaped new paths across dangerous, crowded marketplaces. This is important because we all need an actionable roadmap for becoming the kind of organization that crosses the road before the light changes and lives to build something better on the other side. So with that, I'll turn it over now to Jason. Join me, if you will, in welcoming Mr. Jason Voiovich. Jason, the floor is all yours.
Anthony, thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and I welcome everyone from all over the world today. I want to begin with a very important question. It's probably the most important question we have in the world today. And that is very simple. What makes innovators special? That's the question I've asked myself in the past 28 years. And luckily, what I've learned and what the Global Innovation Institute believes as well is that innovation is teachable. And the question is, why is that? And I believe it's because as humans, we are born innovators. That is perhaps the main thing that separates us from all other creatures on this planet. Now, a few animals might be able to learn to discover a new skill, but only humans can learn about learning. It is our birthright to innovate, and it's my mission to help make that accessible to everybody. So, given the challenges our world faces today at every single level, we need as many people innovating as possible. We can't rely on an elite priesthood of people to do the heavy lifting for us. So, to do that, I take advantage of two important ways we know people learn. The first is through stories. It's so natural, we hardly acknowledge it, right? But stories have a power over our imaginations that data often do not. So I'm going to share several stories with you today to drive home these central points. The second way people learn is through metaphor. Metaphors are frames. They help us organize a set of disparate information into a cohesive whole. I created the Jaywalker metaphor as a simple way to organize just countless lessons into a framework anyone can understand. So during this presentation, I'm going to share 10 traits that set innovators apart. I'll do that primarily through a storytelling approach based on the research on hundreds of innovators over the past 150 years, primarily in the United States. But I want you to be thinking about how those lessons are going to apply in global context wherever you are. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to drive the points home by giving you 10 specific actions you can take to enhance your own innovation efforts today. So let's begin with a quick explanation of the jaywalking metaphor for the innovation process. Your side of the street represents the capabilities that you bring to your effort. Your intellectual property, your engineering talent, your market research, your brand, sales, and capital. The other side of the street represents the customer's need, want, pain, or gain, or job that they have to do. The traffic represents the market reality of getting from one side to the other. And see, really, really easy. I use this in my own practice for two reasons. First, I work with organizations who don't respond well to overcomplicating things. Jaywalking is simple enough for everyone on the team, whether they're trained innovators or not, everyone can understand it. The second thing is it implies action, and this is the important part, implies risk in a way that another simple framework, feasibility, profitability, and desirability, you've probably heard that, that framework doesn't imply risk in the same way. But more important to me is that I'm not just a practitioner and a four-time entrepreneur myself. I'm also a historian, as Anthony said. I've studied hundreds of innovators. I've written 3 books. I'm working on my 4th. And although all the specific situations are unique, they all shared a set of mindsets that allowed them to succeed. Now, I use the word mindset very intentionally, and here's why. In my experience, when we think about all innovation training, we can categorize all of them into 4 major buckets. Now, Dr. Craig Fleischer, a colleague of mine, calls these the 4 sets. Data sets, tool sets, skill sets, and mindsets. Right? For innovators, an example of a data set is census information or venture funding data on Crunchbase. Tableau or ChatGPT are examples of tool sets, ways to query and visualize that data. Prompt engineering or interviewing are examples of skill sets needed to tell the tool what to do with the data it has access to. But what's important, the most important thing, is the mindset. It's how you look at the world. Now, as a historian, I've noticed that innovators over the past 150 years used all manner of different data, tools, and skills, but they all shared a common set of mindsets. Now, as I'm sure you've seen yourselves, the best data, the latest tools, and the sharpest skills are useless when a team proceeds with the wrong mindset. And frankly, I kind of think we spend too much time in innovation focusing on data sets, tool sets, and skill sets. That's why we're going to focus exclusively on mindsets today. Now, some of them may seem like skills that you can develop, but don't get hung up on the specifics. There are plenty of hows to make these work. Stay focused on why. Now, the first Jaywalker mindset is break norms, not rules. Now, let me show you what I mean. Our first example is obvious to any historian. You simply need to look at the pictures. The image on the right shows a typical French family, a well-off French family, it should be noted, around the mid-1800s. The image on the right shows a scene from the Roaring '20s. The difference is striking. Clothing for the well-off in the 1800s was elegant, yet expensive and restrictive. It took as much as 45 minutes to get dressed each day. There are some really cool videos on YouTube, by the way, of that process if you really want to get a sense for what that was like. By contrast, fashions of the 1920s remained elegant, but they were much simpler and allowed for much more freedom of movement. This change in appearances mirrored a massive set of cultural changes during the 1920s in the United States and Europe. However, the look of that era was largely defined by one innovator. This is a young Coco Chanel. Remember what we implied about the French family. Only those who could afford fashion could wear fashion. We don't actually get a lot of paintings of average people of that era, and when we do, they don't look good. Chanel certainly changed how women looked, but what is more important is how she brought fashion to the masses. She pioneered fabrics you could easily clean at home, and not only that, she made fragrances and jewelry cheaper. Take a look at the picture. Those aren't real pearls she is wearing. Those are some of the first composite plastics. In many areas, especially in the United States and Europe, there weren't specific rules on what people could wear. Society created unspoken rules, otherwise known as norms. So let's take a moment to explain the difference between a habit, a rule, and a norm, because this distinction is critical to this first mindset. In my research, I found that innovators rarely attack habits. They're too individual and can be really hard to break. I think you probably know this yourselves. Innovators don't want to convince one person. They want a mass market. Additionally, and contrary to popular belief, most successful innovators aren't breaking the law. They tend to follow explicit rules. No, successful innovators focus on the norms that are no longer serving the society as it evolves. See, in the 1920s, for example, women in the United States had just been given the right to vote. That cultural change, among a lot of others, did not fit with the societal norm of restrictive, largely ornamental clothing. The culture was ready for a different approach, and Coco Chanel gave it to them. See, in your innovation efforts, what you should be looking for is places where the products and services are no longer serving their culture. So let's get into the second Jaywalker mindset, and that is casting a clear, worthy vision. Let's take another example. See, when most people imagine the evolution of retail innovation, it goes something like this. Sears created the first catalog shopping experience in the 1880s. The catalog quite literally had everything, and I mean everything. You can even buy a house out of these catalogs. The next major advance was the big box store in the 1960s, pioneered and still dominated, at least in the United States, by Walmart. And finally, Amazon's e-commerce website in the 1990s, expanding from books into basically everything else. Lots of e-commerce sites now in Europe and in China, especially, that in some ways have overtaken it, but the same general idea. Here's the thing. It's not quite right. Walmart didn't invent the big box store. We're missing an important player, and we tend to forget about it because it failed at about the same time Amazon launched. We're forgetting about Sears, aren't we? Sears not only created catalog retail, they also created big box retail. One of their leaders, Robert Wood, was an ex-military officer who saw the world change. Before the 1920s, people bought products in one of two ways, either in the catalog we just talked about, or in a boutique retail store with a salesperson. Now, as shoppers moved to newly created suburbs outside the city, he knew that people needed the best of both worlds: the convenience and variety of a catalog, and the ability to see and touch all those products, especially new electronics, without a salesperson in a physical store. But see, here's the thing: no one explicitly told him that. There were no big box stores before Sears. I want you to think about that for a moment. He had to convince the leadership at Sears to disrupt their own catalog business and open the first big box store in the suburbs. Now, although it took several iterations to get right, Wood had a crystal clear vision for this new type of shopping experience for this new customer's need. That vision helped him not only understand the correct mix of products, the location of stores, with plenty of room for parking for newly arrived cars, but also how employees were supposed to act. He insisted that everyone work on the sales floor, even executives. He discovered is actually that it was better to train people rather than hire them away from competitors and other retailers. His approach was totally new, and he had a lot of trouble untraining bad behavior. That is the power of a clear vision. It not just defines the offer, it defines everything that surrounds your innovation effort. Now, the next obvious question is, how do you cast a vision? There are 2 points I want to make here. First, use whatever tool you want. Whatever tool that will help your team and your culture gain alignment is the right answer. The jaywalking mindset doesn't depend on a specific tool set or skill. Remember, this is a mindset. It's up here that's the important part. That brings me to the second point. How is not the right question. Why is the right question? In Sears' case, Wood's why was an existential threat to the business. If Sears didn't change to address the needs of this new customer, it would no longer exist. That is what Robert Wood needed to convince Sears management. Unfortunately, there was no one like Robert Wood at the helm of Sears in the 1990s. The thing I wonder about is what would have been different had Jeff Bezos been hired by Sears and invented Amazon inside of Sears? Would we be talking about essentially an entire retail revolution just owned by one company? Let's move on to the third Jaywalker mindset. It should be pretty intuitive for many of you. Observe what others overlook. Now, most people wouldn't appreciate being assigned to Labrador, Canada, that's where this photo is from, for their field assignment as part of the US Department of Agriculture. But most people were not Clarence Birdseye. He was fascinated by everything he saw there, and that included Inuit anglers ice fishing. He noticed that when fish froze quickly, they still tasted good when reheated. Now, if you know anything about freezing food, you know that's not easy. Birdseye discovered that flash freezing was the trick, and he would not have known that had he stayed in his cabin. So when he returned to the United States from this assignment, Birdseye had the idea, right? What else could he freeze and package? Fish, sure. What about other meats? What about vegetables? What about fruits? And yes, over years of trial and error, he found good answers to all of those questions. But Birdseye wasn't just curious for curiosity's sake. He wanted to make something of himself. And in the process, he didn't just figure out how to flash freeze foods to maintain their flavor. He also created a new industry. He spent time with the railroads and the truckers who needed to carry his food, learning how to work with them and their concerns and help them earn money in the process. He spent time with grocers, understanding not only that they needed freezers, they didn't have them at that time, and he found a way to finance them. Kind of a business model we still use in the United States today for capital equipment. He spent time with homemakers to understand how they prepared meals so he could package his foods in a way that made sense to prepare. He didn't want 50 pounds of peas. He wanted a couple ounces of peas or 100 grams of peas. In short, Birdseye was curious about every step in the process, not just the cool science experiment. Now, this part might get a little uncomfortable. My mindset here could be maybe termed curiosity, which I've thought about that. Innovators simply can't succeed without curiosity. But when I go and I take a look at job descriptions for innovators, uh, I, I see ones like this, and this might be readable and it might not on the screen, but I think you've seen this and you understand. It's clearly written by people who have no idea what makes an innovator an innovator. And my question would be, are you attracting the right people for your innovation efforts? And if you're not already, I would start asking about curiosity. So let's go to mindset number 4, bravery. I'll bet a few of you were probably wondering when we get to this one. The Jaywalker metaphor implies running out into traffic. You sure better be brave. Now, the story of Charles Lindbergh doesn't need a ton of explanation for most Americans and even for a lot of Europeans. But for background, he was not the first person to fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean, by the way. His journey did happen to be the longest. But what was really special about him is he was 25 years old, really good looking, and aviation was just starting to take off. Yeah, kind of pardon the pun, I guess. Uh, it's important to know that powered flight was much more of a novelty until the mid 1920s. Only then were planes beginning to show their potential as serious alternatives to lighter than air transportation, like blimps and zeppelins. In fact, that's what most people thought of when they thought of air travel. If you would have asked someone in the 1920s, how are we going to do long distance air travel in the future? It's going to be all blimps because that was the way it was done. Now, you could say Lindbergh was in the right place at the right time, but that certainly didn't mean it was easy. Yes, that flight was brave, but more importantly, and even more brave, was sticking your neck out when it wasn't obvious this whole aviation thing was going to work. Lindbergh parlayed his fame into a major role in advancing the fledgling airline industry. So let's take a look at this and put simply, innovation requires bravery, a leap of faith. All innovations were mocked before they became obvious. I want you to take a look at some of the predictions that you can read on the screen, and I want you to look at who is saying them. Thomas Edison, Time Magazine, founder of YouTube, Stephen Chen. These are not dumb people, but they were still wrong. Of course, you could say that this is simply kind of an example of survivorship bias, that we're not counting all the innovations that did fail exactly as predicted. Sure, but I would say it says more about our need for humility in our predictions and courage in our actions. Put simply, I'm going to tell you, if you're not prepared for a little pushback, I might humbly suggest a different line of work. Let's go to the next mindset. Be careful. This might sound a little bit contradictory, but it's not. Trust me. Let's dig into this. Now, to the untrained eye, there might not seem like a lot of differences between these two very similar homes. I want you to look a bit closer. The second home features a staggering number of non-obvious improvements, the most important of which is the bathroom, and specifically that it includes one, and more specifically that it is placed near the bedrooms and not outside, which are all on the second floor, by the way, all the bedrooms. The layout of the first floor also isn't a complete disaster, with a much more functional kitchen next to the dining area without a weird bedroom in the way, in a much larger family room. Now, to get a sense for this change yourself, come to the United States, go on a tour of an 1800s vintage home. One of the few that kind of still exist. They're quaint, they're interesting, but you wouldn't want to live in one. Now, as the middle class in the United States grew, and especially the suburbs, poorly designed homes weren't going to work. And that we have Dr. Crane to thank for a lot of that. She was one of the first true functional interior designers. Now, through the Better Homes movement, which still exists, by the way, she pioneered model homes that were not only cheaper, but actually functioned. She believed that the home was the woman's sanctuary and that she could improve her life by identifying extra steps in her process. Anywhere where she wasted time or just a couple of extra steps because of layout inefficiency, so she could spend more time not only enjoying herself, but caring for children. She conducted quantitative ethnographic research in thousands of homes. She knew her stuff. Now, yes, of course, it was brave of her to question architects, usually all men, but her true contribution was the careful study of her data that convinced them she was right. Now, we all live in better homes because of her. Now, her lesson, if you want to innovate, be prepared to do your homework. Mindset number 6. Now, the back half of all the mindsets begin to focus a bit more externally. And number 6 is purposely cultivating attention. In other words, whether you're the head of a startup or the leader of an internal innovation team, you must court publicity. So let's start with an example of what I mean, and a story most people know, but sort of misunderstand. It is not true that Xerox engineers didn't understand that graphical user interfaces, or GUIs, had the power to change the world. They simply couldn't get their executives, or anyone else for that matter, to pay attention to their ideas. They even made commercials. There's a link to one in there. I decided not to play it, but it's terrible, just terrible, terrible commercial. And most people just ignore them. It had no creative energy. But there was one person, and I bet you know who it is, who didn't ignore the ad. Steve Jobs offered Xerox 100,000 shares of Apple to get a tour of the Palo Alto research facility, the park, Xerox's research facility. And Steve Jobs knew how to cultivate attention. The GUI, frankly, didn't need engineers. It needed publicity. So Jobs certainly, he wasn't unique and he wasn't the first of his kind, as you can probably guess. Now, that honor could go to several people, but to a historian, probably the most obvious person was Father Bernard Hubbard, though you could probably be forgiven for not knowing who this is. He was the first nature popularizer, kind of like the David Attenboroughs or people like that. He used images and stories to make people care about the natural world in a way they just simply hadn't before. Now, this was in an era in the 1930s when most people didn't travel that far from home. Most people couldn't afford to, and they didn't, especially to a place like Alaska. Now, Hubbard brought the mystery and the wildness of Alaska to audiences in such a compelling way that they thought they had been there themselves. He was so popular, in fact, that Carnation, the milk company, yeah, it's odd at this time, hired him to sponsor their first packaged dry dog food in the mid 1930s, which coincidentally helped create a stronger relationship between Americans and their pets. Now, he certainly couldn't have anticipated that, but he did purposely create a name for himself. He worked on his storytelling, he worked on his stage presence in a way that very few geologists or priests, of which he was both, they usually didn't do that. Now, the lesson from Father Hubbard is real simple. If you want to be an innovator, you need to get comfortable building a persona. So let's get to the next one. Mindset number 7 could get a bit uncomfortable, but let's unpack what we mean by polarization. What you see on the screen are brands and products that generate a powerful emotional response for some people. Sometimes that's unintentional. Bud Light's recent advertising campaign in the United States comes to mind. If you don't know what that is, look it up. And sometimes being different for different sake doesn't lead to financial success. The Tesla's Cybertruck comes to mind there. But don't lose the lesson. To be truly for something, you will, by definition, need to give something up for that. Your innovation cannot be all things to all people. That's obvious to say, but you might be surprised, or you might not be surprised, how often that is ignored. There's a deeper psychological reason here to create a rivalry. And we see it at play with professional sports teams all the time. And innovation, just like a sports team, becomes part of the customer's identity, not just a product that does a job or solves a problem. It becomes part of who they are. And if your product is for everyone, you can't trigger that emotional response. Now, this example might get even a little more awkward. Margaret Sanger is well known in the United States and is a very polarizing figure. However, to her, it was worth it. She saw firsthand as a nurse how poor knowledge of the female body led to disastrous health outcomes for women, especially, and especially for children. She published some of the first factual education materials about women's bodies, for which she briefly spent time in jail in the United States and had to flee to the United Kingdom. Yes, this is certainly brave. It's certainly cultivating the media, but being polarizing is something a little different than that. It's a deliberate move to be for something strongly enough that you're willing to create an enemy for it. And as an innovator, if you don't take advantage of this psychology, your competitor will. Whoops. Let's take a look at the next one. Empathy, the eighth mindset, which should not be a surprise to anyone here. Though how far successful innovators are willing to go might surprise you. Let's take a look at Bill Wilson. There are fewer heartbreaking personal stories and tragedies than late stage alcoholics. You know, for a small group of people, often with a genetic predisposition, any drinking is a downward spiral. They simply cannot stop. And before the 1930s, you know what happened? Chronic alcoholics were put in institutions to die all by themselves as their organs failed and they succumbed to brain damage. It was in one of those hospitals that Bill Wilson had what he called a divine intervention. His idea, probably the most empathetic of all empathetic ideas, was that only alcoholics can help other alcoholics. Today, there are thousands of Alcoholics Anonymous chapters all over the world. And his idea, that divine intervention, that radical empathy, has probably saved millions of lives. Now, just to be clear, it is not necessary to be a user of a product or service in order to innovate, but it can be a powerful source of drive and authenticity. It certainly helps you understand the needs of your customers. And all of these that I'm showing on the screen here are examples of founder users. Spanx, Airbnb, Quizlet, and HabitAware up in the upper right-hand corner. Actually met and coached the founders of HabitAware, one of which, wife in the duo, suffered from unconscious hair pulling, people that would kind of pull their hair, kind of bite their nails. The technical name for that is trichinosis. And they developed this IoT device that you wear, kind of like an Apple Watch, to monitor and interrupt that habitual pattern so that the brain could rewire itself. Now, we see plenty of user-driven solutions in education, housing, clothing, healthcare, places where the average person has more direct experience. But keep in mind, with the rise of AI tools and vibe coding, I can expect to see much, much, much more in previously closed systems like software and hardware technology. I expect an explosion of innovation in those areas. You know, kind of, although Mark Twain didn't exactly say, hey, write what you know, this isn't bad advice for innovators. Let's go to the next one, create reality. This is probably going to be the most challenging of the 10. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. These are examples of reality distortion fields. Now, that term was first coined by an Apple employee. His name was Bud Triple, which name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. He was the first person to do that, and he was describing not just Steve Jobs, but something fundamental to the successful innovator, the ability to bend perception beyond objective facts. For example, the first iPhone was actually a lower priced, less functional smartphone than anything already on the market. And it wasn't just that other companies didn't have a vision. BlackBerry had a clear vision. That wasn't the point. What they didn't have was Steve Jobs' force of will to distort the market in Apple's favor. Now, That distortion can happen in business, like Steve Jobs or like a Henry Ford, but also in entertainment. Think of Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Michael Jackson, or especially in sports. That last one over on the side, for some of you who are younger and grew up in the LeBron James era of basketball, that is Michael Jordan. And he was so intimidating when he walked on the court. Other players statistically played worse. That is the power of creating this reality distortion field, is when you enter the market, other innovators will do worse just because you're in it. Now, we can even go a little farther than that, which is what Washburn Crosby, the precursor to General Mills, did in the 1920s. They created reality from thin air. At first, Betty Crocker, who you're looking at here, using air quotes, responded to letters. Later, she went on the radio. In a few years, demand grew so strong that she fanned out across the country to hold live cooking classes. And yes, there were a few dozen Betty Crockers, sort of like a cooking Santa Claus. Uh, she had her own television show in the United States for decades. And today, she appears on dozens of baking products and commands the leading market position in the US. And she is no more real today than she was 100 years ago, but she's still trusted. Now, innovators, all of us, we cannot be bound by the facts as in the reality that we see today. The future will operate under different rules. It's our job as innovators to create them. All right, the last one, the final mindset, collaborate strategically. This one's going to be hard. And this is especially difficult for internal innovators. Let's talk about it. All right. Oops. Here's what I can tell you after studying hundreds of history's innovators. They are successful in singles and pairs. There might be others involved, but they play clearly supporting roles. Now, anyone who's had any experience with group dynamics understands this through experience. In a team of 5 to 8 people, 1 to 2 do all the work. It might not sound harsh, but it's true. Bigger teams with all those roles sound good, but in the evidence I found doesn't back it up. Now, to use the Jaywalker metaphor, crossing the street into oncoming traffic with a big team is kind of like trying to drag a big team of people to cross the street all at once. You are slow, obvious, and you're probably going to get hit. So let's talk about an example. My research on innovation teams can be kind of summarized in a real simple sentence. Small teams and individuals innovate, large teams execute. Innovators, in my experience, jealously guard their collaboration partners and are ruthless about not letting people on the team for political reasons. There's nothing that demotivates true innovators faster than people hanging on to get their name on a patent. Case in point, the development of color photography film during the Great Depression. It wasn't Kodak who developed it, although they owned patents. It was 2 classical musicians working for about a decade before they allowed the Kodak technicians in to work on transitioning their process from kind of small scale to large scale production. That's why it's so important to have teams that have worked together before. Sports players do that really well. Musicians do that really well. Otherwise, lone operators do. Innovators don't force it. Now, it's natural to think, well, what about a mega project like the Manhattan Project or just massive infrastructure projects, things like that during World War II? Now, when you examine histories, and as innovators you should, you learn that the big project, especially the Manhattan Project, was actually dozens of little projects with small 1 to 2 person collaborations that actually figured out all of the hard stuff. If you've got a big project like that, break it into small ones. And yes, if you're kind of wondering, both of these guys are named Leopold. Don't ask. Long story. Okay. There you have it. Those are 10 Jaywalker mindsets successful innovators throughout history have used to deliver breakthroughs. Stories are great. Actions are better. So I wanted to give you 10 things that you could start working on today. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'm going to tell you what my favorite is. My favorite is the sixth in cultivating attention purposely and getting yourself comfortable with being out there. Get yourself some training, some improv training, where you've got to get up on stage and you don't know what's going to happen, but you need to follow along. Some of you may have done improv training as part of your coursework or have done it before, but if you haven't, it's a great way to build that kind of persona. So obviously you'll be able to freeze frame on this. Let me stop talking and you can kind of get in and you can dig in on that. So to wrap up, I've always thought of treating history as some sort of kind of like this negative thing or some sort of punishment, kind of something you at least subjected yourself to in order to protect yourself against a calamity. That's what George Santayana meant by people are condemned or doomed to repeat it if they didn't study history. We're innovators. We are positive people. That's a really negative way to look at the world, and I just hate it. I utterly reject it. I study history so that I don't just have my own experience to draw on, but I have hundreds of others that can help show me. Makes me smarter, faster, more confident. And history can be that way for you too. There are a couple of my books there. Anthony was kind enough to mention them, as well as Innovation History on Substack. I kind of focus on more contemporary stuff there. I really love that. But mostly, thank you. I appreciate the time and attention you've given me. My mission is not just to help innovators think differently, but more importantly, to invite more people in who aren't innovators yet to join us. So I got my contact information up there. Please get in touch. It's not just that I can help, but it's all of the hundreds of other innovators who are part of the people I know, I've gotten to know over the years, who can help you as well. So thank you. Anthony, back to you. Let's take some Q&A, huh?
Yes, and thank you so much, Jason. Excellent. I love this innovation history. Very, very fascinating. So at this point, we want to open up the floor to the audience to ask questions of Jason and or make comments and let us comment on those. So I would invite you in the question and answer field to interject your questions, or if you'd rather just put a comment in the chat, you can. But give us your questions and let Jason take a stab at those. Barbara already made a few comments here. I'll note that people remember better when there are multiple real-world examples to draw from. So that's a good point. I mean, in other words, they can relate it to something they already know. I think that ties into some of the points you were making there, Jason. So, Jason, well, to kind of get the things flowing, tell me, if you will, who is historically speaking, who has been your favorite innovator and why?
Oh, wow. That's like picking a favorite child. I'm inspired in the different circumstances I find myself in or I find my clients in. It's a matter of who is the right person for the right time. But if you're going to pressure me into picking who the person I most identify with, I most identify with Clarence Birdseye, and I'll tell you why. Clarence Birdseye was promiscuously curious. He was fascinated by everything without exception. Everything interested him. When you read biographies of him, and I just can't do him justice, he would be interested, like he'd be wearing clothes and he'd be interested about how the clothes were put together and the fabrics that were used. He would be interested in whenever he met anyone. You've met people like this before, right? Where they are just fascinated by you. And just his personality was magnetic. And it's something that I try really hard to cultivate in my own personality, is just be fascinated by learning new things. And I bet 99% of what he learned was probably useless. or seemed useless. But what it helped him do, and what was obvious, it helped him connect this to this to this to this in a way no one had thought of before because they just didn't pay attention. He just paid attention and was out there. So I would recommend. There's a biography, and the author's name escapes me, but A Curious Life, I think, is a story of Clarence Birdseye. Fantastic biography. I highly recommend it.
You obviously have read a lot of biographies of different historical figures. I admire the
Yeah, it's
research
not.
you're doing.
Well, it's part of it is kind of another good lesson, and this is Dr. Crane's lesson. Is yes, the biographies are fascinating. They're a great way to kind of get started. But what you really need to do is you need to get into the primary sources. These are what I find the most fascinating is, for instance, 3M Corporation has the records for Richard Drew, the inventor of Scotch tape. He's one of the stories in Bullfrog's Bingo and the Little House on the Prairie. I was actually able to go to 3M and look at his own notes, like all of the notes that he had inventing Scotch tape. And, basically these are if you use sticky notes, there you can see it. It's the same kind of semi-sticky adhesive. And you can actually read, it isn't just the kind of the case study that's written after the fact, it's the struggle he went through to actually develop it. Those are the kind of things that are the most fascinating. And there's plenty of that information out there. You just have to go look for it. And most of it's free. You just have to find it. So it's kind of that hard work that really shows you what innovation is really like, not just the case study that is obvious when you read it later. Everything was hard, and Innovators notes show you how hard it was.
Mhm. So Barbara wants to know, what are some best practices for influencing those who are resistant to trying new things? How do we win over different stakeholders?
Great question. I have found that while lots of people get frustrated with kind of our innovation language and the tools we use and all of that, everyone loves stories. Have a bank of stories that you can tell. And that's one of the best things about studying history, from my perspective, is whenever I run into a situation where someone is just stuck on something or they just don't see it that way, sharing a story that is not about that particular thing but relates to it can be really helpful. And it's kind of the same way that we learn by parable, we learn by fairy tale, we learn by that sort of. There is a reason that is a classic way to teach people, because those little stories with lessons, I'd have a bunch of those in my back pocket. I cheat a little bit because I have hundreds, but you can have a few good ones because I suspect you're running into the same sorts of objections again and again. Have a few that have a few stories that'll help kind of break people through that and kind of break their pattern.
Right. And I would say root those stories and things that those people care about. Start with
Right,
find
of
out
course.
what they care about, what resonates with them, and then tell stories that are focused and centered on that will connect what they care about to what you're trying to sell and helps them connect the dot. That's absolutely great. Buthaina Ben Cretus would like to know, why do you prefer most mindset number 6, cultivate attention purposely? What is special to you in that mindset?
Because it's hard for me. You may not think so, but I'm an introvert. I enjoy research. I enjoy study. I enjoy gathering data. I enjoy telling stories, but it's the process of crafting those stories. It was challenging for me as an innovator. You need to be able to, it's not enough to know your stuff. You have to be able to inspire others. And that was really challenging for me. I think for each of you, you're going to find one of those mindsets, one of the 10 that will resonate for you as maybe some that will come really easily and some that will come a lot harder. And I had to train myself. These are all trainable things. I did improv training myself. Uh, uh, and it was one of the most transformative things for me, not just made me a better innovator, but a better storyteller, better presenter, more comfortable in front of people. You just have to be, even if you're someone in an internal team, you need to be comfortable kind of building those sorts of relationships and responding quickly on the fly when someone says, I don't like that, or I don't believe in that, or I think that's wrong. You need to be able to kind of roll with that in a way that is natural and helps redirect them. And that's sort of learning how to do that strategically and building your skills, for me, was the most important thing. That's why it's my favorite, because it's hard for me.
Okay, so Folashade Owasini would like to know, I really like Rule 3, observe what others overlook. I think if you are observant, you would have obeyed more than half of the rules. But then, being observant is a skill that not many have. How can one build this skill of observant?
Yeah, that's I think the thing I see many innovators failing to do, uh, and I see this all the time, and I wish I didn't, they don't get their hands dirty.
Mhm.
And I mean that very literally sometimes. When I was doing work on, Anthony mentioned up front that I worked on reproductive aids for dairy cows. It is exactly what you think about it. It's some of you have worked on a farm, just you understand this. But for a city kid like me, who'd never seen an animal outside of a grocery store, this was an experience. But I had to get my boots on and get in with the cattle and walk through their droppings, and actually understand what it was like to be with a reproductive technician on a dairy farm to really understand what was going on. It wasn't just kind of the specifics and the research of how it worked, but what did it mean to be behind the business end of a cow? uh, and the smells and the sounds and what you're seeing, and you cannot understand unless you've really been in there. You just can't observe it. You have to get in, and you have to get in there and do it. It's different than empathy. Empathy is kind of understanding. It will relate to empathy quite well, and all of these are related, as you mentioned, of course. But observation requires observing. It might sound obvious, but I can't tell you how many innovators I talk to who are like, oh, you've got this idea for this new product. That's great. Well, have you actually been in that building where they're doing that thing? Like, well, I've talked with some people. Not good enough. Like, just not good enough. You have to actually be there, and get your hands dirty. Most people who are successful get it. Most innovators who are not don't. It's one of those simple things, and you have to have your mindset that, hey, I gotta experience it for myself.
Uh, yeah, and I think you're right. You have to get out from behind your desk, get outside of your office, go out into the field, get your hands and feet dirty. Some investors, like you say, that they won't invest in a startup unless the founders have dirt under their fingernails. They've gone out and they've got involved and they've gotten their hands dirty. And that's the only place you can really do true good observation. So that's certainly what you would do. Roll from the Netherlands would like to know this. What would you advise to organizations that want their employees to jaywalk, but don't want to break up their current sidewalk, obviously?
Yeah, that's that's funny. I think, uh, remind them, that there are difference. When people say, jaywalkers break the rules, that's not correct. And that's why I went through that slide that had the distinction. And I think spending a few minutes with an organizational team, a group of employees, on there's a difference between a habit, a norm, and a rule. Okay, those are the three things. A habit is the thing you do. A rule is policy. It's a contract. It's usually rules are there for good reasons, or at least they are there for reasons. And we want to be careful. There are channels to go through if you want to change your rule. Norms are the ones that are tricky. It's not that there aren't costs to violating a norm. If you do things like, hey, everyone's wearing a collared shirt and I showed up in a clown outfit, that would be violating a norm of what you would expect out of me. There would be a cost to doing that. You might not take me seriously. So there are costs to doing these things. But it is important to know Anthony did not tell me, by the way, that, hey, you need to wear a solid colored collared shirt like he is, like that was a norm that we're sitting down. I'm not walking around. I'm not taking this from my car. Those are norms. Those are the things that we need to examine to see if they are matching what our needs are, because they're unspoken, and their power comes from, and the danger comes from them being unspoken. Those are the ones that we should train our employees to question and to think about. We are not saying, hey, if you think a rule is bad, let's talk about that explicitly. Norms are implicit, and that's what we want to focus people on. So I think if we're going to start to talk with employees about jaywalking, we need to spend a little time on exactly the difference between those three things so that they don't end up, doing things that violate very good rules. There are plenty of examples of innovators getting that wrong and thinking that, well, we're going to break the rules. Yeah, you usually get into trouble. There are a few examples of those who get away with it. 9 times out of 10, they crash and burn hard. And I'm thinking of several examples, and I bet you are too.
Yeah. And the thing about the norms is what's embedded in them are a lot of unspoken assumptions and orthodoxies that we just take for granted. And a lot of the great innovations happen by re-examining those assumptions. When the founders like Brian Chesky at Airbnb, it's because they challenged the norm of hotels. It's like they didn't break any rules. They just said, why do I have to go to a hotel? What if I have extra room? Why can't I just rent that out? Why can't I sleep in someone else's floor? And there was you went to a hotel, right? They didn't break any rules. They broke a norm. And so, that's exactly the point. They were looking at the norms, and they challenged the norm because they challenged the assumptions and the orthodoxies that were embedded into it. And I think that's, again, what you want to teach the innovators is think about the norms, think about what assumptions underlie that, think about what orthodoxies are baked into that, and might the time be right to challenge some of those, right?
Right. That's exactly it. Not all norms are bad, by the
No.
way. If we didn't have norms, we would not know how to operate in a society. But look for those that are no longer serving you for whatever reason. That the culture has moved on, but the norm is still stuck. Usually you get
Mhm.
vibration. You might see some counterculture people kind of explicitly breaking that. And instead of being shunned, those people are being celebrated a little bit. That's a good indication that, hey, maybe the society is ready for that norm to get broken. Because when it's broken and when there's a new norm, well, now that's the new norm. And you need to be examining that one to see is that one still serving the society as it continues to move on? This is a never ending series of examinations. So you'll never get bored. You've got good career security here, good job security.
Very good answer. And so that kind of brings us to the top of the answer. Or the top of the hour. I want to leave with one last question in light of that last answer, and then we'll wrap it up with this. And I'm going to ask you, Jason, to sort of put on your future-looking glass, as you will. And the question is this: what norms today do you feel are right for being disrupted
Wow.
or are about to be disrupted?
That's a really good question. I think that that will depend on what area of the world you're in. I think as much as we like to believe we have a kind of global culture, I've traveled enough to know that's not the case. that it'll all depend on where you are. Uh, I would say, though, that if we want to do something that does have more global impact, I mentioned before that uh, I worked for a good part of my career in high tech, meaning medical technology, aerospace technology, satellites, things like that, that are pretty well closed off to the average person. There's just a level of detail in there that most average people from a technical perspective just can't get at. We have developed in the last 9 months artificial intelligence tools, vibe coding tools that have removed many of those barriers. I think we are going to see technology solutions coming from the average person that we cannot imagine right now. Uh, I think that is going to blow the lid off medical technology. I think we have had gatekeepers in medical technology since the sulfidamide crisis in the United States in 1937, when a whole bunch of people died from basically the Massengill Corporation mixed sulfidamide, one of the first antibiotics. It's actually chemotherapy, technically. Medical people, please don't send me an email on that. They mixed it. They wanted it to dissolve. It does not dissolve in water. They had they didn't have to test anything because there was no real FDA at that time that had any teeth. So they mixed it with diethylene glycol. Diethylene glycol, as you might know, is the same thing you put in your car's radiator, or very similar. Don't drink it, by the way. It killed 111 people. The FDA was created out of that. You had to go to a doctor to get a prescription. You had to go to a doctor for most medical technology. I think in 5 years, a lot of that's going to go away. And I think it's going to blow the lid off of that. We are already seeing I was in aerospace as well. Aerospace used to be in that same way where, gosh, there was just, it took a lot of money to build a fighter jet. That was a big deal. It doesn't take a lot to build a drone with an explosive charge on it. Drones are cheap, and we're seeing that today in conflicts all over the world. Things are going to get weird when we start we have basically given the keys to everybody. And I think we need to teach them how to innovate fast, because they're going to do it whether we like it or not. As innovators, we are the priesthood of innovation. We are the experts. We have a responsibility to teach others how to do this, because they're going to start doing it fast, and they are going to need our help.
All right. Wow, well, that's a insightful look into the future, and very valid points in applying all of these. So I just want to thank you so much, Jason, for sharing your incredible insights with us today about these 10 traits. And I know that's something we can all take away and apply. I want to thank all of our attendees who participated today, and those who will watch this recording, for being a part of our community and watching this. And so with that, we'll sign off for today. And thank you all very much for joining us. Take care, everyone. Thank you again, Jason.
Thank you.